Welcome to the moral man, a man who was underrated, undermined and unlucky. He was castigated for being a weak leader, for high inflation and for a decline in United States prestige. Of course he made mistakes, all presidents do. Among them, he misjudged the rapidly changing political environment. He misunderstood the compounding impact of the economic downturn and miscalculated the damage of various events such as the energy crisis and the Iran hostage crisis. Despite the best efforts of Republicans and other critics to paint Jimmy Carter as a failure, the facts tell a different story. But before we get to that, let's have a look at the influences that shaped the 39th president. If I was asked to sum him up in two words, I would say moral exemplar. This is American academic and poet Maya Angelou. She wrote, "People won't remember what you said or did. They will remember how you made them feel." That's a truism if there ever was one. People won't remember what you said or did. They will remember how you made them feel. This is American champion footballer Steve Young, who said, "Perception is reality." So please keep in mind the words of Miss Angelou and Mr. Young, and we'll come back to them. On the 20th of June 1979, the President of the United States was on the roof of the White House. Throughout the country, Americans were queuing to buy petrol. There was an oil crisis caused by a shortage and an enormous price hike. President Carter was on the roof hosting a media event. His approval rating that month was 28%, about the same as what Richard Nixon's had been when he left office in disgrace in August 1974. President Carter was showing off solar panels he had installed. Conventional wisdom is that James L. Carter Jr. was not a good president. He presided over a recession. American pride took a blow, as I said, and for the first time, Americans thought the country's best years were not ahead of it. That's the conventional wisdom, the perception. The reality, President Carter reduced inflation by appointing Paul Volcker as chair of the Federal Reserve. The fall was not immediate, and his successor, Ronald Reagan, got the credit. President Carter cut the deficit. He cut the growth rate of the federal workforce, and he was a defence hawk. He increased the defence budget, built the MX missile, placed intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe, and directed the high-tech weapons that the Soviet Union could not match. He approved aid to anti-communist rebels in Afghanistan, and he prevented a complete Soviet takeover of Afghanistan. Andrew Young, the former US ambassador to the United Nations, said Carter was the most misunderstood president since Thomas Jefferson, and the only one not to lose a single American soldier in war. A southern hillbilly out of his depth was the impression his political opponents created. But the former governor of Georgia had been a lieutenant in the Navy, a nuclear physicist, and a successful businessman. In November 1975, he was unknown outside Georgia, but a year later, he was the 39th President of the United States. Political success has as much to do with luck as hard work, having the right policies, and having the right staff. Jimmy Carter was a lucky candidate, but an unlucky president. Before we get to that, let's try and get a better understanding of Carter by talking about his childhood and his pre-presidential careers. He was born on the 1st of October 1924 in Plains, Georgia. He was the first United States president born in a hospital. He was the eldest son of a registered nurse, Bessie Lillian Gordy, better known as Lillian, and James L. Carter Sr., a successful local businessman who ran a general store and was an investor in farmland. Carter had 3 younger siblings, Gloria, Ruth and Billy. The Civil War had been over 60 years when Carter was born. Slavery had been abolished, but segregation in the southern states hadn't. It was apartheid. Black people were not enslaved, but they had far fewer rights than white people. That was the world in which Jimmy Carter was born that shaped him and his politics for decades. James Carter Sr. was a staunch segregationist, but he allowed his son to befriend the black farmhands' children. He was a devout Christian and taught Sunday school, which his son also did. James Sr. was a stickler for the truth, which Jimmy later attributed to his abhorrence of lying. But there was a harsher side to Carter's father. He was mercilessly competitive with his eldest son. He always had to prove he was better at tennis, fishing and hunting. Carter Sr. was no paragon of Christian virtue. When he was a teenager, Carter Sr. took Jimmy with him to get a turkey from an attractive young widow. Jimmy thought it odd, as they had plenty of turkeys. His father told him to pick one and wait. Jimmy waited a long time, and when his father and the widow appeared from the house together, Jimmy suspected they might have been doing more than talking about turkeys. Carter sums up his feelings about his father in a poem he wrote decades after his death. "This is a pain I mostly hide, the ties of blood or seed endure, and I now feel inside the hunger for the outstretched hand, a man's embrace to take me in, the need for just a word of praise." Carter and his young family were living in Washington when his father became mortally ill in mid-1954. He died from pancreatic cancer on the 22nd of July. The time Carter spent with him in his final days were interrupted by constant visitors, half of whom were black. Carter Sr. was a community-minded person and held numerous official positions. But many of the visitors wanted to recount acts of kindness that he had shown them that had changed their lives, including giving money. He cancelled debts owed to him before he died. All this had a profound effect on Jimmy. It helped heal the resentment he felt towards his father, and he compared the value of his father's life compared to his. When Carter Sr. died, he left $50,000 in the bank, but $90,000 in bills. Carter returned to Plains to rebuild the family business. Carter was invited to take his father's seat on the Sumter County Board of Education. Carter found enormous inequities between schools for whites and those for blacks. Black students walked to school. Whites went on buses. Black students had textbooks that were discards of the whites. Black schools were often not in school buildings but private homes or basements of other buildings. Carter instigated improvements, including building a new elementary school for black students. The school board experience fired his interest in politics. Having turned the fortunes of the family business around, he was looking for a new challenge, and he announced on his 38th birthday, the 1st of October 1962, that he would contest the Democratic primary election for the state Senate. He ran as an outsider, which he did for every election he contested. On polling day, he won the major counties, except one, that showed his opponent Homer Moore winning 360 to 136. So according to those numbers, 496 people voted, but only 333 had signed to vote, a clear indication of fraud. Carter was furious and wanted to challenge the result, but his supporters warned him not to. Carter refused to change his mind and contacted an investigative journalist at the Atlanta Journal who discovered other irregularities from the county in question in previous elections. Carter needed a good lawyer and hired Charlie Curbo, which began a lifelong association. Curbo advised Carter throughout his career, including the White House years. A judge declared all the disputed votes invalid. Therefore, Carter became the party candidate. But the general election was just 4 days away, and Moore's name was on the ballot. Now, in an indication of Carter's personality, planning for all consequences was something that was a deep part of his nature. Before the court decision, he had bought rubber stamps with his name on them. Carter, Rosalynn, and friends and family spent hours stamping Jimmy's name on the ballots. But just before polling was to start, a Superior Court judge ordered the ballots must be blank for a state Senate contest. Voters had to write their preferred candidate's name. Election officials didn't have time to make the correction to half the ballots, and the judge didn't take any further action. Carter won the primary election. Moore threatened to appeal, but did not go through with it. He went to Carter's house at 6 a.m. one morning and said, "Jimmy, I quit. You can have it." In 1966, Carter ran for the Democratic Party's nomination for governor of Georgia. His campaign was weak on ideology, but strong on integrity and reform, the same as his campaign for president a decade later. Carter lost the primary, last in a field of 3. Lester Maddox, a segregationist and nemesis of Carter's, won the nomination and the general election. Carter was devastated. He left the election night event without thanking his supporters and staff. He didn't concede for 2 days. A few weeks later, he ran his friend and top aide, Hamilton Jordan, to apologise. "I'm tired of people saying I ran a good campaign," he said. "It was not good enough because I lost. I never intend to lose another election." And he didn't until 1980. Lester Maddox was instrumental in causing a monumental event that defined Jimmy Carter's life. Carter had given the campaign all he had. He drove himself and his staff hard, and when he lost, he spiralled into a deep depression. A few weeks after, Carter's sister Ruth joined the family for Thanksgiving in November 1966. Carter was still smarting from the election loss. Ruth had faced her personal demons in the early 1960s and had created a new personal philosophy that was a combination of religion and psychology. She wrote best-selling self-help books, and Jimmy was one of the first people she tried to help. He complained God had rejected him through the people's vote. She said defeat would bring a better life, and quoted James 1:12. "Blessed are those who persevere under trial." Years later, Carter told an interviewer, "I won't tell you my exact phrase, but I thought it was a bunch of crap." Ruth asked him if Christ was more important than his family, his business, and political career. She pressed him, and in a telling response, some might say it was a Freudian slip, he said, "I would rather have the fullness of Christ in my life than be president." Carter describes this time as being born again. He had been a Christian from birth, but now he became an evangelical Christian. A decade later, Carter's sister Ruth joined the family for the Thanksgiving in November 1966. Carter was still smarting from the election loss. Ruth had faced her personal demons in the early 1960s and had created a new personal philosophy that was a combination of religion and psychology. She wrote best-selling self-help books, and Jimmy was one of the first people she tried to help. He complained God had rejected him through the people's vote. She said defeat would bring him a better life and quoted James 1:12. Blessed are those who persevere under trial. Years later, Carter told an interviewer, I won't tell you my exact phrase, but I thought it was a bunch of crap. Ruth asked him if Christ was more important than his family, business, and political career. She pressed him, and in a telling response some might say was a Freudian slip, he said, I would rather have the fullness of Christ in my life than be president. Carter describes this time as being born again. He had been a Christian from birth, but now he became an evangelical Christian. He had a profound religious experience that changed my life dramatically. Since establishing a complete commitment to Christ, I've had an inner peace and an inner conviction and assurance that transformed my life for the better. Carter believed that people of privilege, and especially people of faith, have a special responsibility for those less fortunate, for those who suffer and are deprived. Said Carter, that's where Jesus spent all his ministry. He was among those who suffered most, who were outcasts, who were deprived, who were hungry, who were charged with crimes they didn't commit. His religious fervour rekindled his political ambition, and in 1968 he began campaigning for the governorship of Georgia. This time he didn't talk about race. He knew if he appeared too liberal on race he'd lose. He formally announced on the 3rd of April 1970 that he would run for governor. He promised to reform education and the tax system. He didn't talk directly about race, but he used dog whistles, phrases such as Georgia's heritage, law and order, local control. People knew what he meant. Anti-black. Ronald Reagan used the same technique against Carter in the 1980 presidential campaign. Carter was elected governor. He put away the dog whistle in his inaugural speech. No one was expecting much from the address which Carter wrote himself, lying on his lounge room floor in front of the fire. That this was no ordinary inaugural address was clear in the 5th sentence.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could. Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. Our inherent human charity and our religious beliefs will be taxed to the limit. No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
Did you notice the subdued applause? I'm sure many of those people were thinking, he said what? On the 4th of November 1972, 4 days before the general elections, including that for president, Carter's friend and top aide Hamilton Jordan presented the governor with a plan to win the Democratic Party nomination and the presidency. Remember, this is 18 months before Watergate. Jordan wrote, "Perhaps the strongest feeling in this country today is the general distrust and disillusionment with government and politics at all levels." The first primary election was to be in New Hampshire. Jordan believed a strong win was possible. "I believe that your farmer, businessman, military, religious, conservative background would be well received there." Jordan was the first political operative to identify the importance of early primary election wins to establish momentum that would hopefully build and carry the candidate to the nomination. Another part of the strategy was to raise Carter's national profile among Democratic Party influencers. He was unknown outside Georgia, so he'd invite top party officials and others to stay at the governor's mansion when in Georgia. The strategy paid off. One campaign break shows his luck. Senator Edward Teddy Kennedy was one of his guests. Carter was to give a speech at the University of Georgia Law School on the 4th of May 1974. Travelling with Kennedy was this man, Hunter S. Thompson, of whom you might have heard. He invented what he called gonzo journalism, basically making the writer part of the story, complete with drug-taking references and subjective opinion. Kennedy went to hear the speech, as did Thompson. Carter noticed Thompson leave the room not long after he started speaking. He had dashed to his car and grabbed his tape recorder. Thompson wrote later the speech was a king-hell bastard of a speech that rung every bell in the room. He never heard a more sustained piece of political oratory that impressed him anymore. I've heard hundreds of speeches by all sorts of candidates and politicians, but I have never heard a sustained piece of political oratory that impressed me any more than the speech Jimmy Carter made at Law Day. Thompson brought Carter to a young audience who thought Carter was cool because of his references to his friend Bob Dylan. 5 months after being sworn in as governor, Carter started working on creating a national profile, helped by Time magazine story that was about him and the South. Everything Carter did in the last 2 years of his term as governor was with the eye to the campaign for president. He went on overseas trips, ostensibly to bring business to Georgia, but also to improve his foreign policy credentials. Hamilton Jordan's strategy paid off. Carter won the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. He was an effective campaigner, and luck was on his side. He was lucky that rivals who could have beaten him didn't contest the New Hampshire primary. The win was a great achievement for an unknown Southern governor, and he was lucky in other ways. First, he wasn't working full-time in 1975. His term as governor ended in January that year, so he could devote all his time to campaigning. Second, word-of-mouth campaigning is powerful, and word soon spread about what a good guest and person Jimmy Carter was. He was frugal by nature, and he stayed with supporters instead of hotels when he ran for governor of Georgia, and he did the same when he was running for the Democratic Party nomination. Word soon got around that he made the bed in which he slept with naval precision, and he always left a thank you note. Another word-of-mouth factor was the first-hand testament of about 90 Georgians who travelled to Iowa, New Hampshire and other states at their own expense to tell people they personally knew Carter and what a good person he was. Third, his wife, Rosalind, was an effective campaigner. There were stories about how she converted a room of Iowa voters to Jimmy's side. Fourth, President Gerald Ford replaced his vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, with the more right-wing Bob Dole. Another right-winger, Ronald Reagan, was threatening to win the nomination from Ford, who had been seen to move to the right. Dole was not a strong campaigner and alienated black voters who liked Rockefeller. Ford later said the decision was the worst of his presidency. Carter biographer Jonathan Alter wrote a Ford-Rockefeller ticket would have been hard to beat. Fifth, the times suited Carter. He campaigned as a Washington outsider, and that, along with his message of morality and trust, resonated with voters jaded by Watergate, whose trust in the office of president and government had been shaken. Their national pride had been wounded by Watergate and losing the Vietnam War. Carter left the Democratic Party convention 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford. On election day, he won by just 2 points. He won 50.1% of the vote and Ford 48%. Carter made it clear from just after his inauguration that his president would be different, not just from the words he spoke. Here's a clip from his inauguration speech. The beginning is what democracy is all about, the passing of power from one person to another.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land. In this outward and physical ceremony, we attest once again to the inner and spiritual strength of our nation. This inauguration ceremony marks a new beginning, a new dedication within our government, and a new spirit among us all. A president may sense and proclaim that new spirit, but only a people can provide it. Let us create together a new national spirit of unity and trust. Your strength can compensate for my weakness, and your wisdom can help to minimize my mistakes. Let us learn together and laugh together and work together and pray together, confident that in the end we will triumph together in the right.
Carter made the decision, evidently, just 3 weeks before the inauguration that he would walk after his inauguration back to the White House. And it really was an extraordinary moment. There was a feeling with Carter that he was being a people's president as opposed to the imperial guard that had surrounded Nixon. And so he's walking, Amy is running around next to him. There's a sense of exuberance and a sense that something special is happening. In a certain sense, it was the most important event of the inaugural. It was a great moment. It was very smart dramatically for him to do that.
So, there's hope, great goodwill and expectation. But within 2 years, that hope, goodwill and expectation had been dashed. The lucky candidate became the unlucky president. 1979 was Jimmy Carter's annus horribilis, and it continued into the next year. 3 events over which he had no or little control that sealed his fate. The Iran hostage crisis, the Afghanistan invasion, and a recession, exemplified by a miser index of 20%. We'll come to that shortly. On the 4th of November 1979, Iranian militants stormed the US embassy and took dozens of Americans hostage. Carter worked tirelessly for their release. In April 1980, an audacious bid to rescue the hostages failed when aircraft mechanical problems aborted the mission. Worse, in the confusion of the withdrawal, 2 aircraft collided and 8 American service members were killed. On the 24th of December 1970, Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In response, Carter asked the Senate to postpone nuclear weapons treaty work, recalled the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, demanded the USSR withdraw by the 20th of February 1980, which was ignored, imposed trade and other sanctions, and announced the US would boycott the Olympic Games to be held in Moscow that year. The US was seen to be weak. It was no longer seen to be able to influence world events. The challenges weren't restricted to foreign affairs, but they were connected. In Iran, in January 1979, the American acolyte, the Shah of Iran, was overthrown by Islamic fundamentalists. In the wake of that upheaval, the oil supply dropped by 4%. More significant, the price more than doubled to $39.50 a barrel. There were fuel shortages in the United States which increased prices. World oil production was also hampered by the Iran-Iraq war. Because oil is intricately connected to almost all economic activity, the dramatic price rise had a dramatic effect on inflation. The inflation rate in 1979 was 12.5%, up from 4.9% in 1976 when Carter was elected. The misery index I mentioned earlier is the combination of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. In the late 1970s, both were high at the same time for the first time. The unemployment rate in 1980 was 7%. Combined with the inflation rate, that gave a misery index figure, rounded, of 20%. And that doesn't take into account interest rates. In January 1979, they were 10%. But by March 1980, they were 16%. The reason for the increase was to bring down inflation. We have the same problem at the moment. Carter appointed a monetarist, Paul Volcker, to head the Federal Reserve, the equivalent of our Reserve Bank. He implemented policies to bring down inflation, but the effects weren't evident until Carter's successor Ronald Reagan was in office and he took the credit. There was another factor over which Carter did have control, and it contributed to his defeat. But before we look at that, let's talk about his successors and for what we can thank Jimmy Carter. First, the Camp David Accords. For 6 days, from 6th of June 1967, Israel and Egypt were at war, and although peace was achieved, tension remained. On the 17th of September 1978, the Camp David Accords were signed by Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Israel agreed to a gradual withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula and the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. The two Middle East leaders packed their bags 3 times during the 13 days of negotiation, and each time Jimmy Carter persuaded them to stay. Human rights. Carter made it a cornerstone of his foreign policy. He suspended economic and military aid to Chile, El Salvador and Nicaragua in protest of those regimes' human rights abuses, and he limited arms sales to military dictatorships. The Panama Treaty, and the Panama has been in the news recently. The 82-kilometre Panama Canal connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific that greatly reduces the time for ships to travel between them. From the 1960s, Panama wanted rights over its canal, which the United States controlled. Carter thought it morally right to return the canal. On the 7th of September 1977, the two jurisdictions signed two treaties. One gave the United States permanent right to defend the Panama Canal from threats that might interfere with its continued neutral service to ships of all nations. The second treaty gave Panama the full control of the canal from the 1st of January 2000. Education was another achievement. Carter established a federal Department of Education. Among other things, he increased college tuition grants for disadvantaged students. Energy. He established a federal Department of Energy and introduced tax incentives for home insulation and for solar energy. These sorts of things were way ahead of their time. They're the kind of things we take for granted today, but they were very new back then. Deregulation. Ronald Reagan has the name of being the great deregulator, but Carter started the trend when he ended federal price regulation for trucking, interstate buses, railroads and airlines that increased competition and brought down prices. Another event that damaged Carter was not domestic. It was another international incident, and it wasn't some minor misdemeanour, but it was politically damaging. In December 1978, Jimmy Carter took up running. He approached it like he approached everything, with 100% effort, and it paid off. He reduced his weight from 71 kilograms to 68 and reduced his resting heartbeat from 60 to 40. On the 15th of September, he donned his running gear and joined 750 other runners in the Catoctin Park 10-kilometre race. Experts rated the course's difficulty at 8 out of 10. Halfway, the 39th president reached for a cup of water and missed, but kept running, uphill. He collapsed from dehydration. He tried to continue, which is emblematic of his personality. He never knew and never would know when to give up. 2 hours after collapsing, a well-looking, smiling president presided at an awards ceremony. They had to drag me off, he said. I didn't want to stop. The incident symbolised, though, what people thought about his administration. The cliche, a picture paints 1,000 words, comes to mind, and the thousands of words that have been written about Carter and his perceived failures were encapsulated in this photo. I'm going to show you a couple of clips now. I want you to think about how each makes you feel. Don't concentrate too much on the words, but do concentrate on the body language of each speaker and the feelings they create. The first clip is Carter's address to the nation about the crisis of confidence that I mentioned earlier.
I know, of course, being president, that government actions and legislation can be very important. That's why I've worked hard to put my campaign promises into law. And I have to admit, with just mixed success. But after listening to the American people, I have been reminded again that all the legislation in the world can't fix what's wrong with America. So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
And now, his successor, what he's talking about is self-expression. self-explanatory.
My fellow Americans, I have spoken to you from this historic office on many occasions and about many things. The power of the presidency is often thought to reside within this Oval Office. Yet it doesn't rest here. It rests in you, the American people, and in your trust. Your trust is what gives a president his powers of leadership and his personal strength. And it's what I want to talk to you about this evening. For the past 3 months, I've been silent on the revelations about Iran. And you must have been thinking, well, why doesn't he tell us what's happening? Why doesn't he just speak to us as he has in the past when we've faced troubles or tragedies? Others of you, I guess, were thinking, what's he doing hiding out in the White House? Well, the reason I haven't spoken to you before now is this. You deserve the truth. And as frustrating as the waiting has been, I felt it was improper to come to you with sketchy reports or possibly even erroneous statements, which would then have to be corrected, creating even more doubt and confusion. There's been enough of that. I paid a price for my silence in terms of your trust and confidence, but I've had to wait, as you have, for the complete story. A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Reagan's speech was 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Carter's was 37 minutes. Jimmy Carter's presidency was assailed by bad luck, by events beyond his control. And yes, he created some of his own bad luck. He was a highly intelligent, honourable person guided by a strong moral compass. He was motivated to be a politician by high ideals. He wanted Americans to look deeper into themselves. He questioned the compulsive consumption. He had the vision to reduce the country's dependence on oil. And like his successor, he was anti-big government, but he believed government had a role to help those who needed it. He was in office for 4 years, and he often said that it was just 4 years of his life. He will be remembered for his good works, not just as President of the United States, but in the multiple roles that he took on after he left the White House in 1980.